Hello, my name is Elliot Ruga. I'm the Policy and Communications Director at the New Jersey Highlands Coalition. Tonight, in our continuing series of webinars about issues and aspects of the New Jersey Highlands, we are presenting Beyond Timber, the Future of New Jersey's Forests, in a conversation with Joan Malouf. Our forests are a critical part of the quality of life here in the Highlands as elsewhere. The 360 square mile Highlands Core Forest is essential for the clean water it provides to 70% of the population of New Jersey. This forest provides habitat for the state's greatest diversity of species, many state, federal, and globally imperiled species. The forest provides us with abundant, accessible outdoor recreation opportunities. It filters our air, prevents flooding, and moderates temperature. Many are moved by its natural beauty, and this forest plays a crucial role in New Jersey's climate resilience strategy. New Jersey has been successful in preserving a large part of its forested land, particularly in the Highlands, where a vibrant charcoal-fueled iron industry raised almost all of the forest until the last quarter of the 19th century, when the Highlands furnaces and forges turned to coal as its fuel, and this forest was allowed to regenerate. The forests of today are what have recovered, but it still faces numerous threats from both natural and unnatural invasions. Single interest management objectives, such as to propagate game species, are fragmenting our intact forests, promoting the invasion of non-native species and out-of-control deer populations, which ravishes a forest's understory, preventing regeneration. Pathogens, increasing winds, and severe storms are opening up the forest canopy. We do not need mechanized logging equipment to open it further. New scientific evidence is telling us how valuable older, maturing forests are in sequestering carbon, and more efficiently than younger forests. Aside from a few specimen stands, New Jersey no longer has any old growth forests. What we do have, however, is the future old growth forest to give to subsequent generations. But that will only be if our mature forests are allowed to continue and mature. Before I introduce Joan, we have a few words from our friends at New Jersey Forest Watch and Sylvia Salone. Sylvia.
Hi. Yes, thank you, everyone joining tonight. We're very excited to hear Joan speak. I'm Sylvia Salone, the Executive Director for New Jersey Forest Watch. And for those of you who might not know our group, we are a community grassroots organization that has been battling these forest stewardship plans on Sparta Mountain initially, but now since there's a statewide threat, our group has expanded, and hence you'll see our name is New Jersey Forest Watch. In fact, for those of you who may not know, there are 5 current bills proposed in the New Jersey legislature that, if they were to progress, will forever radically alter our public lands and the creation of these forest stewardship plans, which perhaps maybe on paper might sound like they're okay, but our group has, if I just step away from the camera, you'll see that is an actual clear cut on Sparta Mountain. And this is one of the management, if you will, processes that are, promoted in these forest stewardship plans. So we're really excited to hear from Dr. Malouf and the work that she's done. And our goal has always been to protect and preserve the intact forest canopy, especially in the highlands, but also in the pinelands, where many of you may not know, we not only get our drinking water from that, but also, as Elliot mentioned, there's much more climate change resilience and helps to mitigate the temperature difference that New Jersey is experiencing. And so we're excited to have Joan. And Elliot, if you want to introduce Joan, that would be great.
Sure. I think my cat's insisting on being introduced first.
Oh,
Thank you. Joan Malouf is the founder of the Old Growth Forest Network. Joan has a PhD in ecology. She is a professor emeritus of biology and environmental science at Salisbury University and the author of several books, including Teaching the Trees, Among the Ancients, Nature's Temple, and soon to be released is Treepedia. I met Joan when she came to Sparta to give a talk that was arranged by New Jersey Forest Watch, and I'm very pleased to welcome Joan here tonight. Joan?
Thank you very much, Elliot. Thank you for your beautiful introduction. I'm going to be building on that tonight by sharing some images, and then we'll be answering questions about it. And I also would like to thank you, Sylvia, for your work with New Jersey Forest Watch. Sylvia has been tirelessly speaking for the New Jersey forests, and that's one of the reasons that we awarded her a Forest Advocate Award from the Old Growth Forest Network. So yes, thank you. I am coming to you tonight from Maryland. One thing that Maryland and New Jersey have in common is that we have no national forests. 40 out of our 50 states have national forests, and those states with national forests, it seems like they've been organized for longer to speak out against the threats to the national forest, but the few states without national forest were a little slow in catching up and realizing that we need to speak out for our state forests because they're our #1 public forests. So recently, Maryland came out with their cut plan for the year, their forest action plan or harvest plan, whatever you want to call it. And I shared with other people in the state of Maryland that it was time to comment on the plan. And a reporter picked up some of my comments, and the state forest manager replied to the reporter, and I'm quoting here, "We manage the forest and we cut timber for the health of the forest. If you did not cut it, it would grow, it would die, it would fall down, it would create potential fuel for a wildfire." So these are forests that are the same as yours at Sparta Mountain now, and in the highlands where these forests were also cut for the ironworks, for coal, and now they've recovered about 100 years. So these are 70, 80, 90, 100-year-old forests. So the forest manager believes that they need to cut down or they die and create a conflagration. And then this other quote is by George Werthner, who's an ecologist such as myself. He's also a writer. "This chainsaw prescription is all a scam to promote logging." So the reason he's saying that this state forest manager is saying this because he wants an excuse to cut the forest. And why would he want an excuse to cut the forest? Well, it's likely money, but he's not coming out to say that because it's very unpopular. So there's this kind of disconnect right now between the forest industry, we'll call it, the people trained in forestry, trained to look at wood fiber, and the ecologists that are looking at the bigger picture. In order to really understand the nuances of this argument, you have to understand forest development. So how a forest develops is there's a disturbance. You could call it it could be a tornado, it could be, an intense fire, it could be a glacier. It could be any number of things. And then the forest will start over, establishing, regenerating with the sun-loving species, first the weeds, then the shrubs, then the pines and the cherries. Then as these trees come in, they're racing each other to the sunlight. This is called the stem exclusion stage, and it lasts approximately from the time the forest is recovered 20 years to 80 years. So in this phase, these trees are trying to beat each other out to the sunlight. Some of them don't make it, of course, they all couldn't, and they die. And that's a good thing because it adds wood fiber to the forest floor that's needed for the ecology. But then the strongest trees with the best genetics and the best position, they will win out. And then eventually we get to this canopy transition stage at say 80 to 150 years, where the shade-loving species, such as the beech trees, will start coming in, and other species on the forest floor. And then eventually, over 100 years or so, we'll call it 150 years, we get to this old growth phase. And in the old growth phase, yes, the forest changes continually, but it is dynamic, but we call this gap dynamics, because what happens at this point, we've had some trees that have been able to get very large and very old, and now maybe one of them has been struck by lightning and it dies, and it creates this gap, and it creates this huge gap that some people would say, oh, that's a shame. But as an ecologist, no, this is good, because these gaps let some sunlight hit the forest floor, and there are some species, such as the tree-loving, the sun-loving trees, that need those gaps. And this dynamic gap phase, which is happening through the forest, which could also be created besides lightning, it could be insects killing species, it could be windstorms killing species, it could be any number of things. You know, it could even be a very bad drought that would take some pieces out, or a fire moving through the forest that doesn't affect it all, but affects some of it. What you have is this forest where all the species can live, the ones that need the sun and the ones that need the shade. And we have many different organisms within that forest, that old growth forest, and it can stay that way for thousands of years with this gap moving across the forest. Now, how much forest is left in this old growth phase in the eastern US? Only 1%. And the reason for that is because we've cut it all out. In 1620, old growth forest covered about half of the area in black that you see here. There were some areas that had been disturbed, some that were used by native peoples and cleared for croplands, but the majority of the forest would be this old gap phase forest. And we know that because of the early explorers that came to our land then and described what it looked like. What they were describing was this old growth forest. And by 1850, a lot of those forests were exported to other countries and cleared and used for everything in this new country, from railroad tracks to sailboats. And if you look at the West here, it hadn't been cut hard at that time, but by 1920, even the Western forests were being cut hard. And finally, today, we have this 1% left in the East and 5% left in the West. So that's of the old growth. As Elliot said, it's just these little remnant, tiny little patches in New Jersey. So of course, we don't want any of those little remnants to be lost. But what about the other forest? What about the recovering forest that's now about 80 to 100 years old? We believe in the old growth forest network that we should be letting some of those forests recover into this old growth phase because we have so few of it left. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about how other organisms interact with this forest development. So down here on the bottom, we have the forest going from early successional to late successional. And here they're just saying 100 years plus. But of course, trees can live much longer than 100 years. The point here is that different species like different habitats. So some bird species like the early successional habitat, and some bird species like this stem exclusion phase, and some bird species like the old growth phase. So if we're going to have all the species, we need to have all of the phases. But remember, in the old growth forest, the very old forest, these gaps can act like early successional areas. They are early successional areas. So these birds that like the early successional areas can survive and find the things that they need to live in those gaps if they're large enough. Now, tonight with the forest, I can't talk about everything I want to. I'm going to try to keep this presentation fairly short so we can have time for discussion, but I'm going to talk about birds. I'm going to talk about carbon, briefly mention water. So birds, the reality is we are losing our birds. If you've read any of these scientific papers, millions of fewer birds than we had just 50 years ago. So here are the graphs: forest birds declining, shore birds declining, grassland birds declining. Why are they declining? They're declining for all sorts of different reasons. The grassland birds, it might be a lot due to pesticides and herbicides used on the farm fields that are nearby. It could be that their habitat is destroyed and turned over into farm fields. The forest birds, it could be that we're losing the type of forest that they want, the older forest possibly. It could be something that happens on their migratory routes. It could be feral cats. It could be running into windows. It could be many reasons. All we know really is the outcome. This research is still going on. Here's a graph showing the same data from a scientific paper showing the loss in the different types of bird species, including the eastern forest birds. I'll talk about 4 or 5 birds, just an example. So here's an example, the wood thrush. And we're in the heart of the territory for the beautiful wood thrush, the ground nesting wood thrush with the beautiful song. It is a species of concern in New Jersey, special concern. Look at the population levels of the wood thrush from the late 60s to now. Decline in population. What does the wood thrush need? The wood thrush needs large areas of unbroken forest with closed tree canopies to breed successfully. So these little remnant pieces aren't going to do it for them, the little backyard forests. They need large forests. Why do they need large intact forests? Because their nemesis, the brown-headed cowbird, which is doing pretty well, thank you, likes edges of the forest. So if you're a wood thrush and your nest is near the edge of a forest, it is susceptible to being predated by cowbirds. And most of you probably know what the cowbirds do is they'll take out the wood thrush egg and they'll put in one of their eggs. And then when the cowbird baby hatches, it's larger and more robust and takes most of the food, and it may even push out those other babies. So the brown-headed cowbird doesn't build a nest, they don't feed their babies, they leave it to the wood thrush to do all that. So forest fragmentation benefits the cowbird, and anything that benefits the cowbird is not good for these other species. Many other bird species besides the wood thrush need these large tracts of unfragmented forest for the same reason, mostly because of the cowbirds. And some, we don't really understand why they need these vast tracts of closed forest, but we do know that they do better there. So we're just looking at the scientific results of that. Another example, Cerulean Warbler. You know, look at how the population declined there. They are canopy dwellers. They like the biggest, tallest trees, super canopy, dominant trees. So we take out those trees, and for some reason, the Cerulean Warbler does not do well. Red-shouldered hawk. Now, their nests are not going to be predated by brown-headed cowbirds, but their numbers are declining. We don't understand exactly why. You know, could it be rodenticides? Could it be the lack of their prey species in their forest? But we do know that they require large areas of unfragmented forest. Is this sounding familiar? So ones without pieces cut out of them. And they're easily disturbed. So some organisms do very well right next door to humans, and some do not. And the red-shouldered hawk is one threatened in New Jersey that does not do well in close proximity to human noise and activity. Now, a little bit about the blue-winged warblers and the gold-winged warblers. Very interesting situation. So the blue-winged warblers, shown on this graph by the blue, are more the southern species. They like the forest more. The golden-winged warblers are more to the north, and they like this early successional forest better. And these birds have been interbreeding. It feels like a new thing. There are hybrids now between the golden-winged warbler and the blue-winged warbler, and they're shown in the pale green here. And so that's one reason the pure race of the golden-winged warbler is dying out, is because they're hybridizing and they're becoming this hybrid. And they can be very difficult to tell apart in the field, which makes this call between the blue-winged warblers and the gold-winged warblers complex. And looking at this graph here, this graph shows, now we're talking just about the golden-winged warblers. The range in the historical range is shown in that slashed area. And the range seems to be moving northward. So this dark area is where there's no longer the golden-winged warblers, but the gray area is where there are golden-winged warblers now, where they were not in 1980. So as an ecologist, it feels to me like the range of these birds is moving. And could that be due to climate change? We don't really know for sure. We do know the numbers are declining of the golden-winged warblers also, as they are for so many species. And we know golden-winged warblers like early successional habitat. Now, here's the part that really puzzles me, and I would love to get to the bottom of this, but I am not an investigative journalist. For some reason, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is spending $10 million on a forest restoration project to benefit the golden-winged warbler. Now, remember, there's a lot of other species that are imperiled that aren't getting this special treatment. And this $10 million is supposed to go to create new breeding habitat for, I'm going to back up a second, 1,180 pairs. So that, to me, that's a lot of money for 1,000 new pairs of golden-winged warblers. And this new breeding habitat, they say may include aspen management, timber improvement, and shrubland restoration. I mean, this all sounds good. If you just read it, you would say, oh, this is wonderful. The Fish and Wildlife Service is spending this money to create habitat for this imperiled species, and they're going to improve the habitat. Well, once you really look at what's happening there, okay, wait a minute, let me see if this is what is happening. This is what they are doing for the golden-winged warblers. They are cutting to create the young forest that they think the golden-winged warblers need. Now, this is a state wildlife management area, right? This is your public forest. And this is called Young Forest Initiative. Sometimes you'll hear it called Wildlife Habitat Improvement, or we're going to increase young forest cover. All these treatments, which can sound really wonderful. And also the language, and this is coming from the state foresters, that we need to create these natural disturbances that are now uncommon because we have this closed canopy. Well, natural disturbances are always going to be here. We cannot stop them, right? We have the emerald ash borer killing the ash trees. We have tornadoes coming in. We have the occasional fires. We have windstorms. If you let a forest get old enough, there will always be these natural disturbances that will create these young canopy conditions and spots. We don't need to do this ourselves. This is an aerial image. Sparta Mountain is over here on the right. So the claims that the young forest habitat, that there's not enough early successional habitat, doesn't really make sense to me when I look at these images. I mean, look at all these fields. We could take any one of these fields and say, okay, we're going to pay the owners for this field to go back to forest, and it would do it by itself in a matter of years. We wouldn't even need to plant likely. And there we would have the early successional habitat that the golden-winged warbler needs, if we're really that concerned about the golden-winged warbler. The other places that we have for this young forest habitat, this stripe through here is a very large power line. There's an image of it. I mean, that power line would be a very good place to have a young forest or a shrubland, this habitat for the golden-winged warblers. Or as I just mentioned, we could convert from the poorest agricultural fields or letting abandoned golf courses regrow. Now, I know with the power lines, we would need to cut those young forests and shrublands every 20 years or so to keep them young, to keep that young habitat, and to keep them away from the power lines. And I would be all in favor of that. If we wanted to increase habitat for golden-winged warblers and needed young forests, let's do it. But why are we taking our oldest oak trees and cutting them down for the earliest, for the young forest for the golden-winged warbler? These are literally, this is on Sparta Mountain. These are oak trees that are close to 100 years old. These are on their way to becoming the old growth forest. You know, they were so close, right? Give them another 50 years, they'd start creating their natural gaps and we'd have the habitat. But no, this was in the name of the Young Forest Initiative. And I know a lot of people on this webinar are familiar with Doug Tallamy, who does excellent work about the importance of native plants to birds. And he just came out with a new book where he mentions that oaks support more life forms than any other North American tree genus. Food protection for birds, bears, countless insects and spiders. So we're destroying all that for this one bird. Rather questionable. And I would mention too that this is happening in New Jersey with the golden-winged warblers, but in other states, it's happening with other species, such as the sage, such as the ruffed grouse or cottontails. It's like, depending on where you are, they're trying to convert these forests that are older forests into open forest. And what I see through this myself, and I think the reason that they're going for these older forests to create the young forest is again for money, but they're not saying it. They went for these oaks because these oaks were worth something on the market. So as we lose those oaks, right, we're losing biodiversity on the planet. It's not just birds down the line. And forested ecosystems are habitat for 80% of our terrestrial species. So as we lose these older forests, we lose biodiversity as well. I researched the difference in biodiversity between an old left alone unmanaged forest and this younger managed forest. And the scientific research shows that all of these organisms, salamanders, lichens, beetles, fungi, snails, wildflowers, more abundant in the left alone old growth forests. And carbon sequestration as well is higher in the unmanaged forests. So this word management sounds good, and timber forest habitat improvement sounds good, but when you look at what's really happening and when you look at the data, it's not so good. Okay. Carbon. Now I'm switching over to carbon briefly. The older a forest gets, the more carbon is in that forest, both above ground and below ground. So by taking that old forest and turning it into a young forest, that forest can no longer hold as much carbon. No matter what type of management you do, selective cutting, shelter wood cutting, clear cutting, doesn't matter what type of management, the unmanaged forest, shown carbon, above ground carbon by this red line, the carbon increases with the age of the forest, and it's higher in the unmanaged, untouched forest than it is in the forest that's managed for wood fiber or for Young Forest Initiative. So this has led us to look at something called proforestation. And that is, if we really want to reduce the carbon in our atmosphere, all we have to do is stop logging these forests. And if we can't stop logging them all, because maybe we need wood fiber, you know, I'm sitting at a wood desk right now, and I use my share of wood fiber, but I don't believe that wood fiber should be coming from our oldest forests, our oldest native forests, especially our public forests. It could come from these private forests, which are the majority of the New Jersey forests, or the ones that have already been managed to be plantations. Many things can destroy forests and release carbon into the atmosphere. I know we had a lot of forests out west last year, and they released carbon into the atmosphere. This insect damage, the pine beetles, windstorms, but the number one thing that is releasing carbon into the atmosphere is something we have complete control over, and that is forest harvesting. 85 accounts for 85% of the carbon lost from forests each year. And a lot of that is because of this slash that can be left behind. And as that rots, the carbon in that slash goes back into the atmosphere rather quickly. And also as the sunlight strikes the soil, that fungal growth, that mycelia, so important for the forest, that fungal mycelia can die, and then it releases its carbon into the atmosphere as well. wrapping up now, water, just one slide on that. And we don't hear that much about it, but the forests are so important to the hydrological cycle. And what happens is you'll have the transpiration from the forest. So a small tree can transpire 50 gallons a day from the ground up to its leaves and out into the atmosphere. A big old tree can release hundreds of gallons into the atmosphere that way. So the trees are releasing water vapor into the atmosphere, and that water vapor then condenses as clouds. And when that cloud that has water vapor in it goes over another forest, the forests actually seed the clouds with the particles for the water to coalesce around, and that creates the rainfall. So these particles could be the chemicals that are released by the trees, the terpenes in the atmosphere. Even some bacteria can go up into the atmosphere. I don't know about pollen, but possibly on an upwelling, and that causes a release in rain from the humidity holding cloud, which helps the next forest. And then those trees transpire and it moves along like this. So if you take out one of these forests, then the next forest is not going to have those water vapor containing clouds, and we've thrown off the whole water cycle. So I think you're going to be hearing more and more about this. And finally, when the water falls as rain on a forested environment, that water is likely to seep slowly into the groundwater and recharge the aquifers. But if that forest is not there to slow down and capture that rainfall, any rainfall will go off across the surface, and it will be carrying with it pollutants and sediment and cause these flash flood erosion effects. So biodiversity, yes. Carbon, yes. Also for water. So many reasons to keep these intact forests. As Elliot mentioned, I'm the founder director of the Old Growth Forest Network, and we partner and collaborate with other groups nationwide to try to save the oldest of our forests, especially these public forests. We should be looking at them not as a source of fiber, but as a biodiversity bank, as a carbon bank, and as a water filter. And I would love to see us all stand up together and tell our state forest managers that that's what we would like to see. The Old Growth Forest Network now has 125 forests that are the oldest forests in their county, protected from logging and open to the public. And if you're interested in visiting any of those preserved forests, you can check on our website under forests and get exact directions. We want people to connect with these forests so that they love these forests, so that they know what these older forests look like, so the next generation can stand up for them too. And we're entirely supported by donations from individuals and small family foundations, and we are growing. So thank you for listening, and I hope you can sign up to be part of our network of people that cares about these older forests and wants some of them to stay in our communities. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joan. That was very interesting, educational. Before we get to questions, and they are coming in, just a couple of housekeeping items. Please use the Q&A rather than the chat function if you have questions to the panel. We'll try to get as many in as we can before the end of the presentation. And this presentation is being recorded, and everyone registered will receive a link to the video when it is posted on our YouTube channel. And just a couple of coalition events I'd like to mention. We will have our annual golf event on May 17th at Hawk Point in Washington Township. And we will be launching our first Explore the New Jersey Highlands Hike-a-thon in June. This will be a month-long event with prizes and other fun activities. Make sure you are following the Highlands Coalition on social media or subscribe to our mailing list for more information. So Joan, it looks like U.S. Forest Service is investing over $4,000 per golden winged warbler, or $8,500 for a pair in the northern part of the state. That's pretty incredible. So which tree species would we expect to see in New Jersey's old growth forests if we get there?
One of the beautiful things about the old growth forests that I've seen is how you'll get many different species altogether, depending on where you are. So where I was on Sparta Mountain, it would have been dominated by the oak trees. Even 500 years from now, they would have dominated it. But then you would also find that there would be some pines in there, and you would also find red maples, you would find black gums, you would find many different species that would all be in that environment together.
Okay. Is it true that the golden winged warbler shares habitat with certain game species, and might support for proliferation of the game species and hunting interests really be the reason for some of these aggressive clearings?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's part of it. So when I mentioned the list of other early successional species that are being used as excuses for the young forest, woodcock is another one. And that's one that is a game species that likes early successional habitat. And, you know, it's another one that we're clearing public forests to create habitat for the woodcock, but then at the same time, people are allowed to hunt them and kill them. And that just makes no sense to me. If we're really worried about populations of the woodcock, wouldn't we stop the hunting of the woodcock? So it's more that we want to keep the woodcock alive so we can keep hunting the woodcock, because they have likely a powerful lobby. And if that's the fact, we should admit it and not cover it up and say that it's for the woodcock that we want the early successional species.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an interesting question. The eastern brook trout in question is a member of one of the very few remaining self-sustaining populations known in New Jersey to New Jersey fisheries biologists. It was identified in 2015 in a stream that runs through public land, which was just approved for timber harvesting, which will allow stream crossings in accordance with a best management practice manual that borrows from Georgia pulpwood management practices. Does the golden wing warbler just have better lobbyists than the brown trout?
Yes, yes, I would say. And also, it's complicated, but we should really be looking at this. I believe a lot of people go to forestry school because they love forests, but then once they get into forestry school, it becomes focused on wood fiber. And so it becomes very easy for us to do things, but very difficult for us to not do things. When I say us, I'm including myself with these forestry people, you know. So if you send a forester to a place and say, what should we do? I have rarely heard one say nothing. It's almost always that we should cut something. So that brook trout, absolutely that forest should be left intact to shade that stream, to keep the water cool, which is why that brook trout is there, and to keep those other aquatic organisms alive to feed the brook trout. But the questioner is right that brook trout doesn't have as good of lobbyists. There are not as many people who are speaking up for the brook trout or the salamanders or the fungi.
Someone mentions an article they saw about the wood pellet industry booming and being sold as a sustainable industry. This seems to be a bit dangerous. What do you think, Joe?
Yes, the wood pellet industry is one more threat to our forests. And it's another one where we need to look at the language, because if you think, oh, it's leftover wood from this logging and we'll use it instead of it lying there. And yes, we all like to burn wood and it feels very back to the earth and it feels very full circle. But the reality is that these wood pellet manufacturers are converting. They're not just taking the leftovers. They are cutting native forests and they are changing these forests forever and converting them into these plantations of forever young forests. And it is not sustainable. So do not believe that wood pellets are sustainable. They are not.
Okay. Given the increasing awareness and acceptance and better understanding of a changing climate, do you think it would be more powerful to argue that forest management's top priority should be sequestration rather than biodiversity, as if they were in conflict?
Well, if you do one, you do the other. So I personally believe that the biodiversity is the larger call. I mean, we are on a living planet, right? And that we are watching die because of our actions. So right there, we should be doing something to keep this planet alive. And other people feel that strongly about carbon, but they go hand in hand. So if we preserve the forest for carbon, we're going to preserve biodiversity. If we preserve it for biodiversity, it will sequester more carbon. So I do believe that how wonderful it would be if we could slow down or even halt the logging of our public forests for at least 10 years and see what effect that has on the climate. The majority of the forests, as I said, are privately owned, so we would still have wood fiber. And in fact, the owners of those private forests might get more money for that wood fiber because they wouldn't be competing with the public forest wood fiber. For instance, our national forests provide only 4% of the wood fiber for our country. So I feel like we waste that much. If we were more careful, if we reclaimed more wood, if we recycled more of our paper and had our national forests be carbon and biodiversity banks and clean water banks, at least temporarily, that would be a wonderful accomplishment our generation could make.
Agreed. So someone asks, Lee asks, how does planting new trees? I guess, I don't know if this means where trees did not previously exist or after cutting down trees. How does planting new trees compare to preserving old trees as an effective way to slow climate change?
Well, the new trees, first of all, we're not always so successful in getting them established. The numbers are that about 50% of them die. Maybe they are die from drought, or they're not adjusted to that soil type, or maybe they're eaten by deer. So it may sound good to plant new trees for carbon sequestration, but it takes a lot of effort, a lot of human power. And as I said, they don't always live. And then it will take that little tree maybe 20 years before it starts really sequestering much carbon. And it might take it 50 years before it catches up to those other trees that we cut down. So planting, we don't have that much time. It's much more effective to leave the trees standing that we have now, rather than cutting them down and planting new trees in their place. And that's one of my criticisms of the organizations that are emphasizing the planting of the trees, like, you know, the billion trees. Remember, we were going to do that, or was it a trillion trees? I don't know. Are those trees then protected after we plant them? Or are we going to plant a trillion trees and after they start to get established and really get going, cut them down again? So start looking at that, start questioning that. If people are going to plant trees, ask if they're going to be allowed to live.
Right. And as far as forestation, planting trees in suburban and urban areas, new tree growth, which is a very good thing to do as part of our climate mitigation strategy. But if we're not protecting, at the same time, we're not protecting our mature trees, what will we have accomplished?
Yes, exactly right. Yeah, planting trees in the urban area, very important. But then also heartbreaking to be in a community such, unfortunately, as mine, that doesn't have a tree ordinance. And I'll see people planting new trees, and I'll plant new trees, but then you see the biggest, oldest trees on your block being taken down by the new owners, who also don't always understand the importance of that tree to the whole community.
Right. The New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection just came out with an addendum to their forest stewardship plan for Sparta Mountain. It talks about how shade-tolerant tree species are at risk from climate change. So it makes sense for the forest to try to reduce these species, which seems to be the opposite of the approach they're taking with golden-winged warbler. Do you agree with this? I wonder if they're taking a New England talking point regarding sugar maples and misapplying it to New Jersey.
Yeah, I would have to read the science on that. I don't know. It's a little suspect to me. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
A lot of these things also, I would just say, don't have good scientific background, such as the Young Forest Initiative. There's not a lot of good science to support that. So I am going to be working on a paper with some other scientists where we try to get to the bottom of that and share the science behind that,
Okay.
if there is any.
Someone has commented that they have heard that red oaks in New Jersey are susceptible to bacterial infections. How vulnerable are these trees really to bacterial?
Well, I'd like to say, first of all, that red oaks are the New Jersey state tree. And the majority of what I showed you in those images that were cut off Sparta Mountain were red oaks, and they were beautiful red oaks. Most of them looked very healthy to me. Every organism has its own diseases that can affect it. So every tree has insects that eat it and diseases that could affect it, just like humans have diseases that can affect us. But then there's some of us that are lucky enough to not have a particular disease at a point in time. And it's the same way with trees. There may be some red oaks that are affected by that wilt, but I wouldn't say that it's a reason to cut them, and it's not all of them. Now, exceptions are the invasive organisms that our trees haven't evolved with, that we don't have, they don't really have the capacity to fight, such as the emerald ash borer. I just came from a tour of forests in Ohio and saw many, many beautiful mature ash trees just dead from the emerald ash borer. Most of them are gone. And the hemlock woolly adelgid was another non-native species that is really affecting our hemlock trees. So there are these organisms out there, but taken all together, we're always going to have forest, right? American chestnut, I could mention too, another one that ran through our forest, but yet we have forest. We have some of these organisms that stay. So to preserve the habitat and not worry about the individual diseases and insects so much.
Someone has heard claims that there is more biodiversity in younger forests than older forests. Is there any?
That is absolutely not true. And that is why I wrote my book, Nature's Temples, to look at the research on that, so that there are more fungi species in the older forest, more salamander species, different bird species, as we said, more moss species, more snail species in the older forest, more insect species in the older forest. If you hear somebody saying that there's more in the younger, what they're doing is comparing a forest in this stem exclusion phase, where it's very shady after it's been, this young forest can be very shady on the forest floor because these trees are trying to outcompete with each other. And so on the forest floor, temporarily for a time where the sunlight's not hitting, it is low biodiversity on the forest floor. But if you had a field over here that's filled with weeds, a lot of them non-native invasive weeds, you could say, oh, that field is more biodiverse than this forest. Well, in the forest, in the stem exclusion phase, a lot of the life is going on in the canopy that you can't see, that's not easy to measure. And that forest is on its way to increasing in biodiversity. So that's a false claim. But if you compare younger forest to older forest, older is more biodiverse.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. Doug asks, is there any effort that you're aware of to hybridize American elm as is being done with the chestnut?
I don't know about hybridizing. I know there are cultivars that are resistant, but I don't know that they're being replanted into forests. And there are some American elms that are still alive in the forests that I've seen them. So they're not completely gone. There is some resistance there.
Last question. The 2020 New Jersey DEP State Forest Action Plan will reassess the state forest resources and serve as a strategic plan for responsible forest stewardship. The plan will also play an important role in achieving multi-state strategic forest management initiatives. While this plan focuses on the next 10 years, the changes it will bring over this short time frame will last much longer. Are there any insights or encouragement as to further protection of our forests and better management of invasive species?
We didn't even talk that much about invasives, but they're really a new and growing problem in our forests. So when you cut down the forest to create young forest, you're also creating habitat for these invasive weed species that these forested habitats may never recover from. So that was a long question, but I would just say, as I started out this talk, that there seemed to be a disconnect between what the foresters are saying, what the ecologists were saying, and you got to hear my point of view tonight. And I would encourage each person listening to get involved, to read a little bit more, maybe read some of my books, maybe read some of these scientific papers, read the New Jersey plan, and weigh in with what sounds right to you. So if you want to have brook trout, if you want to have forested public lands where you can walk through the forest and enjoy an older forest and have more old forest instead of young forest, if you want to create habitat for these neotropical migrant birds, I encourage you to get involved and weigh in, whether it's with New Jersey Highlands Coalition or New Jersey Forest Watch or Old Growth Forest Network, or on your own. Just
Well,
have a voice.
thank you, Joan. You know, the conflict in our forest between what is the proper management for our forest is really coming to a head. And I think, you know, we're really pushing that it gets decided in the right direction and soon. And your support and your understanding and knowledge is a great source of information for us and support. And we really, really appreciate the time you spent with us tonight. And I'm sure we'll be calling on you for further support and conversation. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.